The winter of 878. England is no more. There is only a chill, bone-deepening fog that clings to the bare alder branches in the endless swamps of Somerset, and the smell of rotting leaves mixed with the acrid smoke of distant fires. Somewhere here, in this primordial labyrinth of marsh and water, hides the last Anglo-Saxon king, Alfred, ruler of Wessex. But what kind of king is he now? He is a fugitive in his own kingdom, ragged, gaunt, hunted not only by wolves and fever, but by the ghosts of his shattered army. His world, the world of Christian kingdoms, has collapsed, swallowed by a fiery tide from the north. The Great Heathen Army, the unstoppable Viking hammer, has swept across his land like a plague, leaving behind only ash, desecrated altars, and the silence of death. This is rock bottom, the absolute nadir of his fate. Here, in the damp stillness, the central paradox of his life plays out. A man whose soul always yearned for the light of parchment and the quiet of libraries, whose body had been tormented since youth by an unknown, agonizing ailment, now finds himself alone against the most ruthless and physically dominant force Europe had ever known. It seems that history has delivered its verdict. The age of thinkers and scholars is over. The time of barbarians has come. Every gust of icy wind whispers of defeat. Every cry of a bittern in the reeds sounds like a funeral dirge for his people. It is here, at this point of despair, that the defining question of his life is born, a question that will echo through the centuries. How will this broken, sick man, this king without a kingdom, find the strength not just to survive, but to rise from the ashes and crush those who were considered invincible? The answer lies not in the strength of muscle, but in the very trait that now seems so useless, in his scholar's mind, capable of seeing a system in the chaos and a strategy in the despair. But to understand this path, one must first grasp the scale of the abyss into which he had fallen, and see the world that created him, the world he had to either save or perish with. To truly grasp the titanic scale of Alfred's achievement, we must travel back in time to the 9th century and see England through his eyes, not as a single unified state, but as a fragile, war-torn patchwork of feuding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. On this chessboard, Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the center, and East Anglia in the east had long lost their former glory, weakened by internal strife and dynastic crises. They were like overripe fruit, ready to fall at the first strong gust of wind. And that wind came from the sea. The Great Heathen Army, which landed in 865, was not just another band of raiders seeking silver and slaves. It was a force of a completely different order. By various estimates, several thousand battle-hardened warriors united under the command of the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. They were a swarm of locusts, a fiery vortex that moved across the land, devouring everything in its path. Their tactics were the embodiment of controlled chaos. Lightning strikes along rivers on their agile longships, the capture of strategic points, and the use of terror to paralyze the will to resist. The Anglo-Saxons, accustomed to ritualized battles where armies met on an open field in a shield wall formation, were utterly unprepared for this new, asymmetric warfare. Kingdom after kingdom fell to the blows of the Northerners. Northumbria was crushed, its kings executed with the ritual blood eagle. East Anglia followed, its king, Edmund, martyred for refusing to renounce Christ, later becoming a saint. Mercia, once the most powerful of the kingdoms, was brought to its knees and turned into a puppet state. By the 870s, only one fragment of the old world remained, one bastion of Anglo-Saxon faith and culture, the Kingdom of Wessex in the south. It was upon this land, this last stronghold, that the full might of the invincible Vikings was unleashed. And it was Alfred, the fourth brother to take the throne in a single bloody year, who was handed the seemingly impossible mission to stop an avalanche with his bare hands. In this cataclysm that befell the Anglo-Saxon world, Alfred's origins were both his curse and his hidden advantage. Born in 849 at the royal estate of Wantage, he was the fifth and youngest son of King Ethelwulf. In the brutal hierarchy of the early Middle Ages, this meant one thing: he was not born to rule. The throne of Wessex was meant to pass in succession to his older brothers, Ethelstan, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred. This distance from the direct line of succession freed him from the need to immerse himself from a young age in the harsh science of war and intrigue that was his brother's destiny. Instead, Alfred was given what was considered a luxury for a warrior prince: the chance to satisfy his innate thirst for knowledge. His mind was not confined solely to tactical diagrams and the genealogies of enemy clans. Twice in his childhood, he made a pilgrimage to Rome, and these journeys became a true window to the world. He saw the grandeur of ancient ruins, felt the pulse of the cultural and spiritual heart of Christian civilization, conversed with learned men, and according to the chronicles, was even personally anointed by Pope Leo IV. These travels shaped his worldview, showing him that the world was far greater than the bloody squabbles between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the raids of pagans. He saw the legacy of the Roman Empire, founded on law, order, architecture, and literature, and this vision of an ordered, civilized world became deeply ingrained in his soul. While his brothers learned to wield a sword, Alfred was learning to see the forest for the trees, to see the historical process behind the immediate battle. He was a prince who likely felt more comfortable in a scriptorium than on a battlefield, and this made him an outsider in his own family. But it was precisely this detachment, this intellectual depth forged in the shadow of his great brothers, that would become his greatest weapon when, one by one, they fell in battle against the Vikings, and the burden of a crown he never sought was placed upon his frail shoulders. The key to understanding Alfred's character and the origins of his unique strategy lies in an almost mythical story from his childhood, passed down to us by his biographer, Bishop Asser. One day, his mother, Osburh, showed her sons a richly illustrated book of Anglo-Saxon poems and promised to give it to the one who could first learn it by heart. While his older brothers, already young warriors, likely dismissed the challenge with scorn, little Alfred, captivated not so much by the content as by the beauty of the letters and illustrations, was immediately fired with desire. He found a tutor, quickly mastered literacy, and soon recited the entire book to his mother, receiving it as his reward. This episode, whether real or apocryphal, serves as a perfect metaphor for his entire life. Where others saw only a tool for conveying information, Alfred saw beauty, system, and power. To him, a book was not just a set of symbols, but a gateway to another world, a source of wisdom and order in a chaotic reality. This innate love of learning, this passion for knowledge, became the central pillar of his character. He wasn't just literate, which in itself was a rarity for a secular ruler of that era. He was a true intellectual who believed that knowledge was not a luxury, but a vital resource, as essential as food or weapons. This belief in the power of the word and of reason starkly distinguished him from his Viking adversaries, whose culture was oral and whose strength was based on physical might, fury, and a warrior's prowess rooted in mythology. They were a force of nature. Alfred sought to become a force of civilization. He instinctively understood that trying to surpass the Vikings at their own game, in cruelty and courage, was pointless. They could only be defeated by changing the rules of the game entirely, by countering their chaotic force with an ordered system, their oral tradition with written law, their pagan fury with Christian wisdom. And the very boy who once reached for a book, driven by a thirst for knowledge, would one day transform his entire kingdom into a kind of book, ordered, logical, and filled with a meaning capable of withstanding any barbarism. Behind the image of the scholar king and pious Christian lay a dark, debilitating secret that was his constant companion from youth until his death, a mysterious and excruciating illness. Asser describes its symptoms in detail. Sudden, violent attacks of pain that could last for hours or even days, rendering him completely incapacitated. Modern medical experts, analyzing these descriptions, suggest that Alfred most likely suffered from Crohn's disease, a severe chronic inflammatory bowel disease. In the 9th century, an era when medicine was a mixture of herbs, prayers, and superstition, such a diagnosis was a life sentence of suffering. This illness was his personal inner demon, an invisible enemy that attacked him from within, giving him no peace by day or by night. But as is often the case, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The constant battle with physical pain forged in Alfred an iron will and incredible inner discipline. He could not rely on his body, which could betray him at any moment, even before a decisive battle. He was therefore forced to rely on what he could completely control, his mind. The illness taught him the art of long-term planning and patience. He could not afford the luxury of impulsive decisions and daring cavalry charges so beloved by his contemporaries. Every step had to be calculated, every campaign meticulously prepared, because he knew his physical resources were finite. Moreover, his constant suffering heightened his religious devotion to an extreme. He sincerely believed his ailment was a divine trial, sent to him to humble his pride and strengthen his spirit. This faith gave him the strength to endure the pain and to see a higher purpose in his suffering. Thus, his physical weakness paradoxically transformed into his greatest strategic strength. It forced the scholar to become a master of strategy, logistics, and psychology. For when you cannot defeat the enemy with brute force, you have to become smarter, more cunning, and more far-sighted than he is. It was this sick, suffering man who had learned to conquer the pain within himself, who would ultimately find a way to defeat a seemingly invincible foe. The first brilliant flash of Alfred's military genius, not yet as king, but as a young prince, lit up the snow-covered hills of Berkshire at the very beginning of the fateful year of 871. This year went down in the history of Wessex as the year of 6 battles, a year of continuous, desperate struggle for survival. The Great Heathen Army, having dealt with the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, had invaded the heart of Wessex, and the Saxons were in retreat, suffering heavy losses. In January, after a defeat at the Battle of Reading, the Wessex army, led by Alfred's older brother, King Ethelred, took up a position on the high ground known as Ashdown. The Vikings, having divided their forces into 2 columns under 2 kings, Bagsec and Halfdan, and several jarls, began their advance. The Saxon plan was simple. Ethelred would attack the column of the kings, while Alfred would attack the column of the jarls. However, at the decisive moment, something unforeseen happened. Ethelred, a deeply pious man, refused to leave his tent and lead the army into battle until the priest had finished celebrating Mass. Time was passing, and the Vikings were drawing ever closer to the Saxon positions, threatening to seize the tactical high ground. Alfred, just 21 years old at the time, faced an agonizing choice: obey orders and wait for the king, risking the loss of the battle, or take the initiative himself, violating the chain of command. And at that moment, the scholar showed the resolve of a seasoned warrior. As Asser reports, like a wild boar, unable to bear the enemy's pressure any longer, he gave the order for his division to charge. He led his men in a desperate uphill assault against the dense ranks of the Vikings, who had rallied around their banner. It was a tactically insane, yet psychologically brilliant decision. The fierce, unexpected charge threw the Vikings' plans into disarray and bought time for Ethelred to finally finish his prayers and enter the fray. The battle raged all day and ended in a crushing victory for the Saxons. One of the Viking kings and 5 jarls lay dead on the field. Although this victory was not decisive in the war, the Battle of Ashdown revealed for the first time the true nature of Alfred. He was not just a devout intellectual. Within him lived a pragmatic and audacious commander, capable in a critical moment of casting aside the rules and making the only right, albeit risky, decision, proving that a scholar's mind can be sharper than any sword. Behind every great historical act lies not only calculation, but also a deep, almost irrational inner motivation, the fire that compels a person to go on when all others have given up. For Alfred, that fire was his faith. He was not merely a political leader defending his territory. In his own mind, he was God's anointed, the last guardian of Christendom on the island of Britain. This idea was not an abstraction for him, but an absolute tangible reality. He perceived the Viking invasion not as an ordinary war for land and wealth, but in biblical, apocalyptic terms. The pagans who desecrated churches, murdered priests, and erased monasteries, the centers of learning and faith, from the face of the earth, were not just enemies in his eyes. They were God's scourge, sent to punish his people for their sins. And if they were the scourge of God, then he, Alfred, must be the sword of God, the instrument chosen by providence to defend his heritage. This worldview imbued his struggle with a higher, sacred meaning. He was fighting not for Wessex, but for the very idea of Christian civilization against pagan chaos. This profound conviction gave him incredible resilience. Even in the darkest days, hiding in the swamps of Athelney, he did not see himself as merely a defeated king. He believed he was passing through a crucible of trials, like those endured by the biblical prophets. This faith was the source of both his cruelty and his mercy. He could be ruthless to those who broke oaths sworn on Christian relics, because to him it was not just betrayal, but sacrilege. Yet he could also show astounding magnanimity, as in the case of Guthrum, offering the defeated enemy not death, but baptism, because the salvation of a lost pagan soul was a more significant victory to him than mere physical annihilation. It was this inner core, this certainty in his divine mission, that allowed him not to break under the weight of defeats and to transform a desperate defense into a holy war for the future of England. He fought not for a crown, but for a cross, and that made him indestructible. After the catastrophic defeat in early 878, when the Viking army under Guthrum seized his royal residence at Chippenham in a surprise winter attack, Alfred was forced to flee with a handful of loyal warriors. His kingdom was occupied, his army scattered, and he himself became a phantom, hiding in the impassable marshes of Somerset at a place called Athelney. This period could have been the end of his story, but instead, it became its true beginning. It was here in the mire of despair that the scholar began his transformation into a great strategist. He realized that the conventional war was lost. To try and assemble a new army and throw it into open battle against superior Viking forces would be suicide. The very nature of the war had to be changed. Athelney, surrounded by swamps and rivers, became his impregnable fortress, the perfect base for waging guerrilla warfare. From here, his small mobile units launched daring raids, inflicting swift and painful blows on the Vikings before vanishing without a trace into the familiar labyrinth of the marshes. It was a war of attrition, a war of mosquito bites against a bear. Alfred and his men attacked foraging parties, intercepted small detachments, and kept the Viking garrisons in a constant state of tension. Every successful raid was not only a military blow, but a psychological one. Rumors that the king was alive and still fighting spread throughout Wessex, inspiring hope in the hearts of the people and undermining the Vikings' confidence in their total victory. Alfred used this time not only for military actions. He analyzed the causes of his defeats, studied the enemy's tactics, their strengths, and their weaknesses. He understood that the Vikings' main strength was their mobility and lack of vulnerable supply lines, while their weakness was their constant need to forage for food in hostile territory. And it was this weakness he began to exploit. The war from the swamp became a harsh school for him, where he mastered the fundamentals of asymmetric warfare. He gathered intelligence, recruited supporters, and built up his forces, turning his refuge into the nerve center of the future resistance. It was a slow and painful process, but it laid the foundation for the miracle that was to happen in the spring. From the mud and fog of the Somerset marshes, a new army and a new strategy were being born, capable of challenging the invincible conquerors. In the spring of 878, after several months of grueling guerrilla warfare, Alfred sensed the time was right. On his secret orders, the Fyrd, the militia from Somerset, Wiltshire, and part of Hampshire, began to assemble at a designated place, near Egbert's Stone. It was an act of incredible courage and faith. Men flocked to the call of a king many thought dead, uniting to form the last army of the Anglo-Saxons. Seeing the assembled host, Alfred, according to the chronicler, felt immense joy. He was no longer a fugitive, but a leader guiding his people to a decisive battle. He marched his army towards Edington, where his intelligence indicated Guthrum's main camp was located. The battle, which took place in May, became the culmination of his life and a turning point in English history. Alfred, using the lessons learned from past defeats, did not rush into a reckless attack. He arranged his warriors into a dense, monolithic shield wall, a tactic the Anglo-Saxons had perfected. This living fortress of wood, leather, and steel was capable of withstanding the most ferocious Viking charge. The battle was incredibly fierce and long. As Asser writes, Alfred fought fiercely, forming a dense shield wall against the entire army of the pagans, and strove long and bravely until at last, by God's help, he gained the victory. The discipline and fortitude of the Anglo-Saxons, multiplied by their desperation and faith in their leader, proved stronger than the wild fury of the Northerners. The shield wall held, and then it itself went on the offensive, putting the Vikings to flight. The rout was complete. Alfred pursued the remnants of Guthrum's army to their fortified camp at Chippenham and laid siege to it. After 2 weeks, tormented by hunger and thirst, the Vikings surrendered. But what happened next revealed the true scale of Alfred's genius. He did not execute his enemies. He offered something unthinkable, a peace based on a new reality. The dawn at Edington was not just a military victory. It was a triumph of strategy, faith, and order over chaos, the moment when the sick scholar finally proved he could crush the most formidable warriors of his age. After the crushing victory at Edington and the surrender of Guthrum's army, Alfred faced a strategic choice that would define the future of England for centuries. The traditional path, that of an ordinary warrior king, dictated a simple and clear solution: execute the Viking leaders and sell the rest into slavery or exile them. It would have been an act of vengeance, just and expected. But Alfred was no ordinary king. His scholar's mind saw beyond the immediate triumph. He understood that destroying one army would not solve the problem. Others would come to replace it, and the war would continue endlessly. He needed not just to defeat the enemy, but to neutralize the threat itself, to transform it from an existential one into a manageable one. And so he made a decision that was staggering in its boldness and foresight. He offered Guthrum, his sworn enemy, peace. But this was not just a peace treaty. Alfred demanded that Guthrum and 30 of his most noble warriors accept Christianity, and he himself volunteered to be Guthrum's godfather, who took the name Ethelstan at his baptism. This act, known as the Treaty of Wedmore, was a geopolitical masterpiece. On a symbolic level, it signified a complete ideological victory. The pagan chieftain knelt not only before the King of Wessex, but also before his god. On a practical level, it created an entirely new political reality. Alfred did not expel the Vikings. He legally granted them the right to the lands they already controlled: East Anglia, parts of Mercia, and Northumbria. This territory became known as the Danelaw, or the land of Danish law. Thus, with a single stroke, Alfred transformed an uncontrollable horde of invaders into a settled population, into neighbors with whom he could negotiate and whom he could assimilate. He established a clear border, which became a line not so much of hostility as of cultural and political interaction. Baptizing the enemy was not an act of naive mercy, but the cold, pragmatic calculation of a genius who understood that the surest way to conquer an enemy is to make him part of your world, subject to your rules. Having won at Edington and secured peace, Alfred knew full well that this was merely a respite. New Viking fleets could appear at any moment. To ensure the long-term security of his kingdom, he needed not just an army, but a comprehensive system of defense that could counter the Vikings' main strength: their speed and surprise. And here, his analytical scholar's mind shone in all its brilliance. He devised and implemented one of the most ambitious military engineering projects of the early Middle Ages, the system of Burhs. This was a network of 33 fortified towns and forts, strategically placed throughout Wessex. The principle of their location was ingeniously simple. No inhabitant of the kingdom should be more than 20 miles, a day's journey, from the nearest burh. This meant that in the event of a Viking raid, the peasants had enough time to take refuge behind strong walls with their livestock and valuables, depriving the raiders of their primary objective: easy plunder. But the burhs were more than just shelters. Each had a permanent garrison, the size of which was calculated by a special formula based on the length of the walls: approximately 4 men for every 5.5 yards of wall. These garrisons could not only defend the town, but also launch sorties, attacking Viking parties that dared to venture deep into Wessex territory. As a result, the entire country was transformed into a giant chessboard, where each burh was a powerful piece controlling the surrounding area. The burh system completely paralyzed Viking tactics. Their lightning raids became pointless. Instead of defenseless villages and monasteries, They encountered well-fortified strongholds, and their small detachments risked being cut off and annihilated by the Boer garrisons and Alfred's mobile forces. This stone web, cast over the map of the kingdom, was a direct embodiment of Alfred's mind, ordered, logical, systematic, and utterly lethal to the chaotic and impulsive war machine of the Vikings. It was the solution not of a warrior, but of an architect and a strategist. In parallel with the creation of the Boer network, Alfred tackled another critical problem: army reform. The traditional Anglo-Saxon military system was based on the Fyrd, a general levy of free landowners, thanes, and sea-earls. Every such warrior was obliged to report for service with his own weapons when summoned by the king. This system was effective for short-term campaigns and repelling local raids, but it was completely unsuited for a prolonged war against an enemy like the Vikings. The problem was economic. When all the men went to war, the fields were left untilled, the harvest was lost, and the kingdom faced famine. The Vikings, not tied to the land, could wage war year-round, whereas the Fyrd could only be kept in the field for a few weeks. Alfred, with his systematic approach, saw the root of this problem and found an elegant and revolutionary solution. He did not abolish the Fyrd, but reorganized it. He divided the entire levy of the kingdom into two, and according to some sources, even three parts. Now, when the king called for a muster, only one half of the Fyrd went on active service, while the other half stayed home and continued to work the land. After a set period, likely several months, a rotation occurred. The warriors from the active army returned home, and their places were taken by those who had been farming. This seemingly simple administrative move had colossal consequences. First, for the first time in its history, Wessex was able to maintain a permanent battle-ready army in the field, capable of conducting long campaigns, besieging fortresses, and pursuing the enemy without fear of economic collapse at home. Second, it significantly increased the professionalism of the warriors. Regular service turned yesterday's farmers into experienced veterans. The reform of the Fyrd was no less important than the building of the Burhs. It was another manifestation of Alfred's unique talent. He didn't invent anything entirely new, but he took existing institutions, analyzed their flaws like a scholar, and then optimized them, turning them into effective tools for achieving his goals. The two halves of a single army, working as a unified mechanism, became the living shield of the kingdom, which, combined with the stone shield of the Burhs, made Wessex virtually invincible. Having secured his kingdom militarily and engineered its defense, Alfred turned his gaze to diplomacy. Understanding that unity among all Anglo-Saxons was essential in the fight against such a powerful foe. His main target was Mercia, once a great kingdom, which, after defeats by the Vikings, had been split in two. The eastern part was under Danish rule, while the western part maintained a fragile independence under the governance of Ealdorman Ethelred. Alfred knew that a friendly Mercia was not only a vital buffer protecting Wessex's northern borders, but also the key to the future unification of England. Instead of trying to conquer his weakened neighbor, he chose the path of an alliance, sealed by blood. He married his eldest daughter, Ethelfled, to Ethelred, the ruler of Mercia. This marriage was not just a dynastic union, it was an act of supreme political wisdom. Alfred did not treat Ethelred of Mercia as a vassal, but recognized him as a legitimate ruler, albeit a junior partner in their alliance. This alliance immediately bore fruit, combining the military resources of Wessex and Mercia into a single fist. But the true significance of this union was revealed in the person of Ethelfled herself. Alfred had raised a daughter in his own image, intelligent, educated, decisive, and possessing a remarkable talent for strategy and governance. After her husband fell ill and retired from active rule, Ethelfled effectively took control of Mercia. She continued her father's policies, building Burhs on the borders with the Vikings, leading her army on campaigns, and reconquering town after town from the Danes. She went down in history as the Lady of the Mercians, a one-of-a-kind female ruler and military commander who commanded the absolute respect of her warriors. The alliance through blood, forged by Alfred, did more than just secure his kingdom. It laid the foundation for a future offensive into the Danelaw and, most importantly, produced a new generation of leaders in Ethelfled and her brother Edward, Alfred's son, who would together complete their father's work and unite England under the rule of the House of Wessex. It was a long-term investment in the future that only a true statesman could make. Alfred was a man of the land, a king whose strength lay in his soil and his people. But his insightful mind understood a fundamental truth that many of his contemporaries overlooked. The threat to England would always come from the sea. The Vikings were a seafaring people. Their longships, long, fast vessels with a shallow draft, were the key to their military might. They allowed them to strike anywhere, anytime, to sail up rivers and appear where they were least expected. Trying to fight them only on land was like cutting off the heads of a hydra. For every one severed, 2 new ones would grow. Alfred came to a radical conclusion for his time. To defeat the Vikings, he had to challenge them in their own element. He initiated the creation of the first Royal Navy in English history. But true to his principle of do not copy, but surpass, he did not simply build ships in the image of the longships. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Alfred personally participated in the design of the new vessels. On his orders, they were built almost twice as long as the others. Some had 60 oars, some more. They were both swifter and steadier, and also higher than the others. This was not just a quantitative, but a qualitative superiority. The higher freeboard gave English warriors an advantage in boarding actions, while the greater length and number of oars provided superiority in speed and maneuverability on calm water. The creation of the Navy was a bold and expensive undertaking, and its first steps were not always successful. The Anglo-Saxons were not as skilled sailors as the Vikings, and their new, cumbersome ships sometimes ran aground. But the very fact that Alfred took the war to the sea had immense strategic significance. His fleet could intercept enemy squadrons as they approached the coast, patrol the shoreline, and protect the river mouths, preventing the enemy from penetrating deep into the country. The birth of the English Navy was yet another testament to Alfred's genius, his ability to think systematically and proactively. He understood that true defense begins not at the walls of a fortress, but on the distant frontiers. This scholar, who perhaps suffered from seasickness himself, laid the first stone in the foundation of the naval power that many centuries later would make Britain the ruler of the seas. In the midst of the struggle for his kingdom's physical survival, when it seemed all resources and thoughts should be directed towards the war, Alfred initiated a project that might have seemed like madness to his warrior contemporaries. He began a great educational and cultural reform. Herein lies the essence of his genius and the solution to the central paradox of his character. Alfred was deeply convinced that the military defeats of the Anglo-Saxons were merely a symptom of a deeper problem, a decline in knowledge and wisdom. The monasteries, which had been the centers of literacy, had been burned by the Vikings. Latin, the language of the church and of learning, was all but forgotten, even among the clergy. Alfred saw this not just as cultural degradation, but as an existential threat. A people who had lost their wisdom and history were like a person who had lost their memory, defenseless and doomed to defeat. He therefore decided that his main mission was not only to rebuild fortresses of stone, but to restore the fortress of the spirit. He gathered at his court a circle of distinguished scholars from across Britain and Europe, including his future biographer Asser from Wales. Under his guidance, this think tank embarked on an unprecedented program: the translation of the most important Latin texts into Anglo-Saxon Old English. Among the translated books were such pillars of Christian and classical thought as Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, Orosius's History Against the Pagans, Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, and most tellingly, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a philosophical treatise on fortitude in the face of fate. Alfred did not just oversee the process. He personally took part in the translations, writing prefaces in which he explained why wisdom was essential for both the salvation of the soul and the effective governance of the state. He believed that knowledge should be accessible not only to clerics, but also to the secular nobility, those who governed the country and led its armies. The sword of knowledge, in his view, was no less important than the sword of steel. This cultural revolution was his primary long-term weapon. He fought barbarism not only on the battlefield, but also on the pages of books, countering the destructive force of the Vikings with the creative force of civilization. Like the Roman emperors he so admired, Alfred understood that a strong state is built not only on an army, but also on law. The chaos brought by the Viking invasions had affected not just cities and fields, but also the minds of men, shaking the foundations of justice and order. To mend the social fabric of his kingdom and strengthen his authority, Alfred undertook another monumental reform: the creation of a unified code of laws known as the Dambok, or Doom Book. This was not a mere compilation of old decrees. It was a carefully crafted synthesis of legal traditions, reflecting Alfred's own worldview. In a long preface, he laid out his legal philosophy, beginning with the Ten Commandments and other laws from the Bible, thereby asserting that all human law must derive from divine law. He then selected what he considered the most just laws of his predecessors, kings of Wessex, Mercia, and even Kent, the first Christianized Anglo-Saxon kingdom, showing respect for tradition and aiming to create a code that would be acceptable to all Anglo-Saxons, not just his own subjects. This approach was crucial to his goal of the future unification of England. Alfred's Doom Book regulated various aspects of life, from punishments for murder and theft to rules for making contracts and protecting church property. Special attention was paid to the concept of the oath and the responsibility for breaking it. For Alfred, who had repeatedly faced the treachery of the Vikings, the sanctity of a given word was the cornerstone of a stable society. By creating a single, written, and understandable code of laws, Alfred achieved several goals. First, he strengthened justice and order in his kingdom, reducing internal strife. Second, he affirmed his legitimacy as the supreme judge and protector of his people. Third, he contrasted the Anglo-Saxon world, based on law and Christian morality, with the world of the Vikings, which in his eyes was a world of lawlessness and brute force. The Doom Book became another element of his comprehensive strategy. He was building not just a war machine, but a cohesive, viable society capable of withstanding external threats through its own internal strength and unity. The period of peace and reform that followed the Treaty of Wedmore was not to last forever. In 892, a new, massive Viking army, one of the largest ever to invade England, landed on the shores of Kent. It consisted of 2 fleets, totaling some 350 ships, and was led by one of the most experienced and cunning Viking chieftains, Hásteinn. This was not just an invasion, it was the final examination for the entire system that Alfred had so painstakingly built over a decade and a half. Had this happened in the year 78, Wessex would have been doomed. But the England of the 90s was a completely different country. The new wave of invaders, joined by some Vikings from the Danelaw who broke their oaths, was met not by a disorganized militia, but by a well-oiled defensive machine. Wherever Hásteinn moved his forces, he ran into the impregnable walls of the Burhs. An attempt to take one such fort, Rochester, ended in a humiliating failure for the Vikings. The garrison held out stoutly, and soon Alfred's main army arrived and forced the besiegers to flee. The mobile units, formed from the rotating Fyrd, constantly harassed Hásteinn's army, preventing it from establishing a foothold or securing supplies. The system created by the scholar worked like clockwork. Each element, the Burhs, the reformed army, the fleet patrolling the coast, performed its function, creating an unbearable environment for the enemy. The war against Hásteinn lasted for 3 agonizing years. The Vikings darted across the country, from Kent to the Welsh border, trying to find a weak point in Alfred's defenses, but they never managed to achieve any significant victory. They suffered from hunger, disease, and constant attacks by the Anglo-Saxons. This return of the dragons became the unintentional but most convincing proof of Alfred's genius. He had created a system that was not just effective, but self-regulating and resilient to the most severe shocks. Finally, in 896, exhausted and demoralized, Hásteinn's army disintegrated. Some sailed to Francia, others settled in the Danelaw. The threat was neutralized, and this time, for good. Among Alfred's many strategic achievements, the revival of London holds a special place. The ancient Roman city of Londinium, situated on the River Thames, was an ideal commercial and strategic hub, but by Alfred's time, it lay in ruins, repeatedly sacked by the Vikings and virtually abandoned. In 886, as part of his strategy to strengthen his borders and create a united Anglo-Saxon front, Alfred launched a campaign and recaptured London from the Danes. But he didn't just capture it. He initiated a massive program of restoration and redevelopment. On his orders, the old Roman walls were repaired, a new street grid was laid out, and new wharves and markets were built. London was transformed into one of the largest and most powerful burhs in his defensive system. Alfred entrusted the city's governance to his son-in-law, Ethelred of Mercia, another gesture that strengthened their alliance. The revival of London had colossal symbolic and practical significance. On a practical level, it gave Alfred control over the Thames Valley, a vital waterway, and created a powerful outpost on the border with the Danelaw. The city quickly became a thriving center of trade and craftsmanship, strengthening the kingdom's economy. But even more important was the symbolism of the act. The capture and rebuilding of London, which was formerly in Mercian territory, but was restored by the King of Wessex, was a powerful declaration. Alfred was demonstrating to everyone, both Anglo-Saxons and Danes, that he was the protector not only of his own kingdom, but of all English Christians. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle proudly reports that after this, all the English people that were not in subjection to the Danes submitted to him. This was a key moment in the formation of a common English identity. London, reborn from the ashes by Alfred's will, became a living symbol of Wessex's invincibility and the hope for a future united kingdom. The city that was once a gateway for invasion had been transformed into a castle guarding the heart of England, and this castle was built not so much by a warrior as by a visionary urban planner and statesman. The implementation of such large-scale and costly reforms as those conceived and executed by Alfred could not have proceeded smoothly in a society accustomed to living by older rules. Although history paints him as a national hero, in his lifetime he inevitably faced internal resistance and a lack of understanding. The construction of 33 Burhs demanded enormous resources and labor duties from the local population. The reform of the Fyrd, which required landowners to take turns serving for months in the military, far from their homes, also caused discontent. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, the ealdormen and thanes, accustomed to a certain degree of autonomy and short-term military campaigns, did not always greet with enthusiasm the demands of their king, who forced them to spend silver on fortresses and take men away from the fields. The chronicles speak sparsely of these conflicts, but the biographer Asser alludes to the disobedience and negligence of some subjects in carrying out the king's orders for building fortifications. Alfred had to be not only a military commander, but also a skilled politician, persuading, cajoling, and sometimes compelling his nobles to follow his course. He constantly inspected the works, instructing and reprimanding the negligent, proving time and again the vital necessity of these measures. The price of survival was high, and not everyone was willing to pay it. Furthermore, the burden of perpetual war and constant vigilance weighed heavily on the king himself. He was the center of the entire system, its brain and its engine. He had to plan military campaigns, oversee construction, engage in legislation, direct the translation of books, and all the while battle his debilitating illness. It was a colossal internal struggle, demanding superhuman willpower. The story of Alfred is not only a story of victories over an external enemy, but also a story of overcoming internal resistance, inertia, and conservatism. He was a reformer who dragged his society into the future, sometimes against its own will, proving that the path to salvation lay through order, discipline, and sacrifice. His ability to manage this internal pressure and see his reforms through to completion is no less a feat than his victories on the battlefield. One of Alfred's key insights as a strategist was his understanding of his enemy's logistical vulnerability. The Viking armies were like sharks. They had to keep moving to breathe, that is, to plunder in order to feed themselves. They had no centralized supply system and lived off the land they passed through. Alfred realized that if he could deny them this opportunity, their war machine would simply grind to a halt. And so he began to systematically apply a scorched earth tactic, not against his own population, but against the invaders. The system of Burhs played a key role in this strategy. When a Viking army entered a region, the local population, on signal, would take refuge in the nearest Burh, bringing their livestock and hiding their grain stores. As a result, the Vikings found themselves in a hostile, desolate landscape with nothing to eat. Any attempts they made to forage were met by mobile Anglo-Saxon units that sortied from the Burhs and attacked small enemy groups. In this way, Alfred starved the enemy, depriving them of their main strength, mobility. A large Viking army would quickly consume all available supplies in an area and be forced either to move on or to divide its forces, becoming vulnerable to attack. This strategy was particularly evident during the war with Hasstein. In one episode, when the Viking army moved up the Thames Valley, Alfred positioned his army between them and their ships, cutting off their route of retreat and supply. As the chronicle reports, the Vikings were afflicted by lack of food and had to give up their own children as hostages and swear an oath to leave the kingdom, just to be allowed passage back to their ships. Alfred learned to use the very geography of his country as a weapon. He turned the fertile fields of Wessex into a deadly trap for uninvited guests. It was a brutal but extremely effective tactic, another testament to his cold, pragmatic mind. He understood that a war could be won not only with a sword, but by depriving the enemy of a piece of bread, and he turned logistics from a supporting discipline into a primary weapon against a seemingly invincible army. Alfred was not only a strategist, but also a shrewd psychologist who masterfully used his reputation to achieve his military and political goals. He understood that wars are won not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of people, both his subjects and his enemies. He deliberately cultivated an image of a ruler who was at once severe, just, and merciful. This duality made him unpredictable, and therefore an even more formidable opponent. On the one hand, he could be absolutely ruthless. Vikings who swore an oath to him on holy relics to leave his kingdom and then broke it faced certain and exemplary execution. When Alfred's fleet captured 2 Viking ships that had been engaging in piracy off the coast, he ordered all the captives to be hanged. These were not mere acts of revenge, but clear signals sent to the entire Viking world. A word given to the King of Wessex was not an empty sound, and breaking it would be met with harsh retribution. This reputation deterred many from betrayal and made his enemies think twice before violating a treaty. On the other hand, he showed unprecedented mercy to those who were willing to lay down their arms and accept his terms. The most striking example is the baptism of Guthrum. Instead of humiliating and destroying the defeated enemy, Alfred elevated him, becoming his godfather and bestowing rich gifts upon him. This move was designed to split the enemy camp. It showed other Viking chieftains that it was possible to negotiate with Alfred, that surrender or making peace did not mean certain death or slavery, but opened a path to status and wealth. This carrot and stick strategy was extremely effective. It encouraged desertion from the Viking ranks, sowed discord among their leaders, and ultimately weakened them from within. Alfred waged psychological warfare as skillfully as he waged conventional war, proving that the sharpest blade in the scholar's arsenal is a deep understanding of human nature, its fears, ambitions, and weaknesses. In an age when battles were often won by brute force or blind luck, Alfred placed his bets on his greatest advantage: information. He was one of the first in medieval Europe to realize the crucial importance of intelligence and espionage in a war against an unpredictable and mobile foe. Trying to guess where and when the Vikings would strike next was almost impossible if one relied solely on watchmen in lookout towers. A systematic effort to gather information was needed. Although the chronicles have not preserved the details of his intelligence network, the results of its activities are evident from his military successes. Alfred always seemed to know where the enemy's main forces were, what their intentions were, and where they were headed. This allowed him to act proactively, to concentrate his forces in the right place at the right time, and to dictate the terms of battle to the enemy. His network of informants likely consisted of merchants, traveling monks, and even Anglo-Saxons living in the Danelaw who remained loyal to the old king. He used his knowledge of his own country as an absolute advantage. He and his commanders knew every forest, every river, every path in their kingdom inside out. The Vikings, as foreigners, often moved blindly. This advantage in knowledge of the terrain allowed Alfred to set ambushes, block escape routes, and choose the most advantageous positions for battle, as he did at Edington. He turned the entire territory of Wessex into his home field, where he knew every bump in the ground, and the opponent was forced to play by his rules. This invisible war, the war for information, was the ideal battlefield for the scholar, It required not muscle, but an analytical mind, the ability to connect disparate facts, draw conclusions, and make swift decisions based on the data received. While the Vikings relied on their fury and surprise, Alfred countered them with systematic data collection and deep strategic planning, proving the old truth: knowledge is power. Beyond his military and administrative reforms, Alfred waged another, less visible but no less important war, an economic one. He understood that the Vikings' prosperity was built on two pillars: plunder and the trade of stolen goods. To undermine their power, he had to strike at this economic model. One of his first steps was monetary reform. He put an end to the debasement of coinage, which was common in other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and began minting a new, high-quality silver penny with a high precious metal content. These coins featured his profile and name, which in itself was a powerful statement of his authority and stability. Alfred's high-quality, full-weight currency quickly became the preferred medium of exchange not only in Wessex, but also beyond its borders, displacing inferior money from circulation. This allowed him to control the economy and trade. Taking control of and rebuilding London was also part of this economic strategy. By controlling England's main trading port, Alfred could regulate trade flows, collect duties, and channel wealth into his own treasury, rather than into the pockets of the Vikings. He encouraged the development of crafts and trade within his kingdom, creating a domestic market that was less dependent on external instability. At the same time, his military reforms inflicted direct damage on the Viking economy. The system of Burhs, which deprived them of plunder, and the navy, which hindered piracy and the slave trade, struck at the very root of their prosperity. Alfred systematically dismantled the Vikings' business model. He transformed England from easy prey into a well-organized, economically self-sufficient state, where raiding became increasingly risky and less profitable. This economic war was another front on which the analytical mind of the scholar triumphed over the chaotic model of a raid economy. He was building a long-term, sustainable economic system that ultimately proved to be far more viable than the predatory economy of his opponents. One of the most vivid and telling examples of how Alfred's intellect triumphed over the Vikings' brute force is an episode that occurred during the war with Hasstein in 895. The Viking fleet, fleeing pursuit, sailed up the River Lea, about 20 miles north of London, and built a fortified camp there, intending to winter in safety. For an ordinary commander of that time, there were two options: either try to storm the camp, which would have resulted in huge losses, or organize a long and grueling siege. But Alfred, arriving on the scene with his army, saw a third, unconventional solution. He did not attack. Instead, he carefully surveyed the terrain and the river, and his engineering mind came up with a brilliant plan. He ordered his men to build two forts, Burhs, on either side of the River Lea, slightly downstream from the Viking camp. Then, between these forts, he had them erect obstacles, perhaps driving piles, stretching chains, or scuttling barges that completely blocked the river channel. As a result, the Viking fleet, their primary means of transport and escape, was trapped. They were like fish in a barrel. Realizing their ships had become useless wooden boxes, the Vikings fell into despair. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports, they abandoned their ships and fled overland towards Quatbridge, while the people of London triumphantly brought the abandoned longships into their city. This episode is a pure demonstration of the supremacy of intellect. Alfred did not lose a single warrior in a senseless assault. He defeated the enemy using geometry, engineering, and a deep understanding of how to use the landscape to his advantage. He outplayed the Vikings not on their battlefield, where fury and the force of a blow decide the outcome, but on his own, where intelligence and unconventional thinking prevail. The blocking of the River Lea became a perfect metaphor for his entire struggle. The sick scholar, unable to compete with the Vikings in physical strength, simply dammed the river on which their very lifeblood flowed and forced them to admit defeat. The grueling 3-year war against Haystein was the climax and final triumph of Alfred's military system. It was not a single battle, but a whole series of campaigns, maneuvers, sieges, and skirmishes that stretched across central and southern England. And at every stage of this conflict, it became clear that England had changed forever. Haystein's Vikings operated according to their usual pattern: rapid movements, attempts to find a weak, undefended place to plunder and escape with impunity. But wherever they went, they were met by the new reality Alfred had created. When they invaded one part of the country, the mobile half of the Fyrd, led by the king or his commanders, immediately marched to meet them. At the same time, the garrisons of the Burhs in other regions remained in place, preventing other Viking groups, including those from the Danelaw, from coming to Haystein's aid. It was a war on multiple fronts, which Alfred coordinated with the skill of a grand strategist. He constantly held the initiative, pursuing, harassing, and cornering the enemy. He cut them off from supplies, trapped them on rivers, and crushed their foraging parties. The system worked flawlessly. It was flexible, resilient, and deadly. It had turned England into an impregnable fortress, a viscous swamp in which the most experienced and formidable Viking army of the time became bogged down and drowned. By 896, Haystein's army, having failed to win a single major victory, and having lost thousands of warriors to the sword, famine, and disease, was utterly spent. It fell apart. Haystein and the remnants of his men sailed ingloriously back to the continent. The last great Viking campaign against England in Alfred's lifetime ended in their complete and crushing defeat. And this defeat was inflicted not so much by the force of arms as by the power of thought. Alfred did not just repel an invasion. He demonstrated that his system had made the very existence of Viking raiders in his country impossible. He proved that his kingdom was now not just effectively defended, but virtually impenetrable to the enemy. Ultimately, the story of Alfred the Great provides a complete answer to the paradox at the heart of his destiny. How did a sick scholar manage to crush the invincible Vikings? The answer is both simple and profound. He won precisely because he was a sick scholar. His physical weakness forced him to develop what he was strong in: his intellect. His love of books taught him to think systematically, to see not just the immediate problems, but the underlying causes, and to build long-term strategies. Where an ordinary warrior king saw only an enemy army to be defeated in the field, Alfred saw a complex, multi-layered problem that required a comprehensive solution. The victory over the Vikings was not the result of a single successful battle, but the triumph of an entire system that he designed and built. It was a system in which every element had its place. Military reform, the division of the Fyrd, ensured a permanent standing army. Engineering reform, the network of Burhs, neutralized the enemy's tactics. Naval reform, the building of a fleet, protected the borders. Legal reform, the Doom Book, strengthened social stability. Educational reform, the translation of books, revived the nation's spirit and wisdom. And economic reform, the minting of coin, undermined the enemy's prosperity. Alfred did not try to play the Vikings' game. He created his own rules. He countered their fury with discipline, their chaos with order, their speed with calculated defense, their strength with intellect. He understood that literacy, law, and faith embodied in a well-organized state were, in the long run, far more powerful weapons than the sharpest axe and the fastest longship. The paradox was resolved. It turned out that fortresses built of stone and logic are stronger than those held together by the fury of dragons alone, and the will of one intellectual, driven by a great idea, could change the course of history. On the 26th of October, 899, Alfred the Great, king of the Anglo-Saxons, died at the age of about 50. His passing was as untypical as his entire life. He did not fall in battle, pierced by an enemy spear or sword, like so many of his predecessors and foes. He died in his bed, in the peace he himself had so painstakingly won and built. His quiet death from the chronic illness that had tormented him his whole life was the final, silent testament to his greatest triumph. He lived to see the day his kingdom was secure. He departed knowing he was leaving behind not chaos and imminent civil war, but a strong, stable, and protected state. He was passing the sword and the cross to his son, Edward, who had been raised within the new system and was ready to continue his father's work. He was leaving his daughter, Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, as a loyal ally and co-ruler in the north. He had created a dynasty and set in motion a program for the decades to come, a program for the complete liberation and unification of England. His death did not mark the end of an era, as was so often the case in those times. On the contrary, it was a point of transition, proof that the system he had created was viable and could function even without its creator. He was the watchman who stood guard through the darkest night, weathered the most terrible storm, and left his post only when dawn was breaking over his land. He was buried in his capital, Winchester. The end of his journey was peaceful and dignified, in stark contrast to the brutal and bloody age in which he lived, and in that quiet lay his greatest legacy. He brought to his world not only victory, but order, not only survival, but the hope of a lasting peace. In the pantheon of English monarchs, spanning more than 1,000 years, only one has been honored with the epithet, the Great. Not Richard the Lionheart, the great crusader. Not Henry V, the victor of Agincourt. Not Elizabeth I, who defeated the Spanish Armada, but Alfred, the King of Wessex, who began his journey as a fugitive in the swamps. Why did history single him out? Because his legacy is immeasurably deeper than mere military victories. Alfred was not just the King of Wessex. He was, in essence, the founding father of England. Before him, there was only a geographical concept and a conglomerate of warring Anglo-Saxon tribes. Alfred was the first to begin thinking and speaking of a unified Anglo-Saxon English people, united by a common faith, language, and law in the face of a common enemy. His military reforms saved the physical existence of this people. His legal reform gave this people a common law. But most importantly, his educational reform gave this people a soul. By insisting on the translation of books into the Anglo-Saxon tongue, he saved and effectively standardized what we now call Old English, the direct ancestor of the modern English language. Without Alfred, there would be no Beowulf as we know it, no Shakespeare, no Dickens. He laid the foundation of English literature. He created the idea of a state that is responsible for the education and welfare of its subjects. He created the first English navy. He created a system of urban planning that influenced the development of English towns. He is seen not just as a successful warrior, but as a visionary, a civilizer, who, in history's darkest hour, lit a candle of knowledge, law, and national identity. The epithet, the Great, was bestowed on him not by his contemporaries, but by the historians of later centuries, who, looking back, could fully appreciate the scale of his personality and the all-encompassing nature of his achievements. He did not just win a war, he created a nation. And so we arrive at the final, comprehensive answer to the central question. How did a sick scholar manage to crush the invincible Vikings? The answer is that Alfred fundamentally changed the very nature of the conflict. He understood that you cannot defeat a plague by fighting each of its individual carriers. You must change the environment, creating conditions in which the plague cannot survive and spread. Alfred did not so much defeat the Vikings as he made their traditional way of life a model of existence based on raiding, plunder, and mobility, absolutely impossible within the territory of his kingdom. He starved them of food with his system of Burhs and scorched earth tactics. He deprived them of mobility by blocking rivers and creating a navy. He stripped them of the element of surprise with intelligence and the constant readiness of his reformed Fyrd. He shattered their self-confidence by countering their pagan fury with unshakable faith and iron discipline. He attacked their economic model by taking control of trade and minting a stable currency. And most importantly, he attacked them ideologically by creating a prosperous, educated, and just Christian society that was a far more attractive and viable model of civilization than their own. He won not one war, but several at once: military, economic, engineering, psychological, and cultural. In the end, the Vikings had to either leave or assimilate, accept his faith, his laws, and become part of his world, as Guthrum did. Alfred did not just crush a Viking army, he crushed the very idea of the Vikings as a dominant force. He proved that a well-organized, intellectually developed, and spiritually united society can withstand any external threat, no matter how formidable. His victory was not the victory of one army over another, but the victory of system over chaos, of civilization over barbarism. The story of Alfred the Great transcends the chronicles of the 9th century, becoming a universal and timeless myth about the human spirit. It leaves us with one simple yet profound thought. The most powerful weapon mankind has ever possessed is not in our hands, but in our heads. Alfred was the living embodiment of this truth. In an age that glorified physical strength, martial prowess, and the fury of the berserker, he gambled on what was considered secondary: knowledge, logic, planning, and faith. His story is the ultimate refutation of the idea that brute force always wins. It proves that strategy can overcome numbers, discipline can overcome fury, and order can overcome chaos. Alfred teaches us that when faced with a seemingly insurmountable threat, be it an enemy army, a deadly disease, or our own despair, the victor is not the one who is stronger, but the one who is smarter, more patient, and capable of seeing beyond the horizon. His legacy is not just a united England. It is the very idea that civilization is a fragile but precious construct that must be constantly defended, strengthened, and developed through education, law, and a common purpose. And herein lies the ultimate lesson for all time, left to us by the scholar king. When the mind becomes the primary weapon and the will an unbreakable shield, even a single sick man, surrounded by enemies and betrayed by his own body, can not only endure but can crush any army, no matter how invincible, and change the world forever.